Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to our event, the Palestine Plus 100 event. Can everyone hear me actually all right, yeah? Okay. Okay. My name is Basma Ghalaini. I'm the editor of the book. I'm also editor of Palestine Plus 100. I'm also a freelance translator from Arabic to English and English to Arabic. I would like to start off by saying I've got a bit of a cold, so bear with that, please, thank you. I'd like to thank the International Anthony Burgess Foundation and the Manchester Literature Festival for hosting this event, and also the Arts Council in England for supporting us. The idea of this book was twofold. The first was to encourage Palestinian writers to storm the front of science fiction, as it were. Because it's a genre that's wasn't, as far as we are aware, it wasn't written about that much. It wasn't written about that much by Palestinian writers. The second reason was to encourage Palestinian writers to explore the Palestinian condition through the science fiction genre and see, use it as a way to talk about Palestine. Comma had already established this genre within the Arab world with the Iraq Plus 100 book. So we had a model to go by, where we commissioned the writers to talk about Palestine and Nakba in a way that where we asked them to envision what Palestine, or wherever they are, what Palestine would look like 100 years from Nakba, how they imagined it would be, and they all sent us the stories back, and here we are. The reason we chose Nakba as a point of reference was because of what it represents to Palestinians. Nakba is the single point that changed Palestinian history. I mean, there was a very long build-up to it. There were decades and decades of planning, and by the Zionist Foundation and the British. There were decades of planning before it actually reached the point of May 1948 of Nakba, starting with the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and probably before then, and ending with the Nakba, which was when 750,000 Palestinians were displaced and expelled from their homes, and 13,000 were killed in a massive ethnic cleansing operation that took place in the Palestinian land in Palestine. And as historian Ilan Pape, Israeli historian, says that there was a year exactly before Nakba of planning, immaculately planning this event and how it was going to take place, and the rule of thumb was, if they don't leave, we kill them, and that's what happened. And overnight, Palestinians found themselves without a home, and those who were displaced were told they can't go back, and it's been a knock-on effect ever since. We're still seeing the effects of Nakba every day till this very point. That's why we can't stop talking about it. It's not history. It's history, but it's also present. It's something that's still ongoing. So we need to be, as Palestinians, keep reminding ourselves of this as a way to keep it fresh in our minds. So today we are delighted to have two of our writers who are in the book, Anwar Hamed and Selma Dabbagh. Anwar Hamed is a Palestinian novelist, poet, and literary critic. He's living in London, where he works for the BBC World Service. His novel Jaffa Makes the Morning Coffee was longlisted for the IPAF International Prize for Arabic Fiction, and his most recent novel is Shajan. Selma is a British Palestinian fiction writer living in London. She grew up between the UK, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, and has also lived in Bahrain, Egypt, the West Bank, and France. Her first novel, Out of It, was a Guardian Book of the Year. Several of Selma's short stories and plays have won or been nominated for awards. So Selma and Anwar are going to read bits of their stories, and then we're going to go on to just chatting, and then will be a bit of Q&A. So we'll start with Selma, who will read some of her story, which is Sleep It Off, Dr. Shots.
Yeah.
Shot.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm going to read 2 parts of my story. So the beginning, and you will see from the beginning that the main character is something called a recorder. So she's recording people. And then I'm going to jump a little bit forward, and I'm going to give you one of her recordings, and that's the reading I'm going to give you. So it's set in Gaza in 2048. And it's called Sleep It Off, Dr. Shot. And it starts, I'm going to send this on as a voice file to both of you. It's a vocal digital letter of apology. No, it's more than that. It's a vocal digital letter of apology with evidence. I have the recordings and I will include them. That is what I do, after all. I record things, like you two, for example. If you've ever been in the Enclave's basement, you'll know where I am by the sounds that are being picked up. The drones are a bit more muffled down here, and you can hardly hear the netting. It's just the rattle of the air conditioning vents most of the time. Given that this is a letter of sorts, I should probably be more formal and present my case with specifics, as any scientist should. It's the 15th of June 2048. I'm recording this in the security bunkers of the Secular Scientific Enclave Gaza, and my name is Layla Watan. I'm from Deir el-Balah. You know Deir el-Balah, the camp in the south that's spilling over into the sea? My family are from Haifa, but by that I mean my great-grandparents lived there over 100 years ago now. As I said, this is an apology, a way of explaining to both of you. I couldn't explain at the time because I couldn't speak. I still can't get your voices out of my head. It doesn't help that I keep replaying the recordings. Here's one of Dr. Shot shouting at me when we finally met, our first and last encounter, the one where he asked who I was. Shot. Who is this girl? What are you doing? Munna, why is this woman in the corridor? Give me that. I can tell you what Professor Camel said to me after that, but I think you might prefer to listen. She's a recorder. Look at her equipment. Who gave you this? I'd rather you didn't think of me as being a creep or a snoop. I'm not even a proper spy. Okay, yes, I was a recorder, but I really hadn't known what that meant before I was recruited. I was sorry for the shock I caused you both. I can hear it in your voices, where you asked me why I was spying at you. But the short answer was that I would have sold my kidneys for a job in the Enclave. The whole of Gaza is desperate to move here, not just because the food is guaranteed and it's about as safe as it gets if you obey the rules. It was mainly because the Enclave was a type of revolutionary idea we were starving for, turning global perceptions of us on their head. I'd watched them build it from my home, the Secular Scientific Enclave. It sounded like heaven to me. At that point, there'd been rumors about the Hyperloop. It was true, but there'd also been talk about the coming of the next Messiah, the return of our lands in 48 Palestine, and compensation. I'd never believed any of it. For decades, our building methods had consisted of little more than plastering over dirt-packed bags, so for us to see those steel frames and glass panels shoot up to create giant quartz spikes piercing the sky was like, wow, awesome. We watched them grow from our baked-in alleyways overrun with wheelchairs, chickens, and petty criminals. I should explain that the noise out there, back home, was without end or form. It was as though it grew out of the walls and expanded when released. We spoke of the Enclave's silence as a mystical force, and I'd anticipated inner calm to go with it. But when I entered the walls, it wasn't like that at all. For all of us in security, accommodation was down here in the bunkers. I went for weeks without seeing any natural light. I had electricity and hot water, but after a while I started to feel like the water, my uniform, even the walls were all trying to bleach me inside and out. I knew of you, Professor Kamal, since I was young. The faces of you and your family were graffitied onto the walls of our camp. Munna Kamal, a legend, we all worshipped you, particularly the women. I knew of your construction of the first generation of body bots in the underground bunker in Rafah. your ingenious use of 3D printers to create robotic limbs for the disabled, creating our own army of semi-indestructible fighters. I'd heard of how this army burst through the borders in 2032. I knew that your husband had been killed in the bombardments that followed, that you'd also lost your daughters to shelling. I wanted to believe that I was protecting you, Professor Kamal. As you probably guessed by now, part of the purpose of my mandate was to find out what the nature of your interpersonal relations were with Dr. Schott. So we'll stop there and do one quick thing, which is just a recording of Schott and Kamal talking. So these are two scientists in this secular scientific enclave that are developing a hyperloop connection under the border. So this is Schott. This is recording one. Schott. I couldn't sleep last night. And Schott, I should probably explain, Schott is Israeli born, but there'd been a referendum in Israel where everybody with less than 50% Jewish DNA has been kicked out. And because Schott is a bit of a lefty, he's gone to a bit sort of more idealistic. He's taken up the Gazans on their offer to join this scientific enclave. So he's one of the only Israeli borns there. So there are two scientists working together in this tower. Schott. I couldn't sleep last night. I couldn't get this idea out of my head about Hentriacontane. Kamal. Beeswax? We're working on a bullet here, not a steam engine. There are no rails to rub it on, Dr. Schott. Sometimes I wonder why they put you in our team. Schott. I don't know where you get these ideas from. Schott. The oldest ideas are the best. Kamal, is that a line from your tailor? What, you've got a problem with my pants? Corduroy is the epitome of fabric design. There was nothing left for fabric evolution to do once they'd hit upon corduroy. Men, Kamal, men and corduroy, RIP 2020. Schott, where were you in 2020? Kamal, well, I guess I'd just been starting as an undergraduate at MIT. Schott, crazy, you know, I was at Harvard doing my postdoc at the time. We could have, Kamal, been in the same book club? Sure, a geeky one on circuitry and bearings. Kamal, and waxy tracks in a vacuum for transporting pods. Schott, I can kind of see you there in the old part of Boston with dark eyeliner and a puffet jacket. I bet you hung out in the bookshop. You know, the one with the great cafe? Kamal, on the square. Yeah, you're right, I did go there. But you're wrong about the eyeliner. I was far too serious. Schott. Who was the man? In 2020, you said that their evolution stopped. Who was the epitome of male evolution? Kamal, with microphone enhancement used. My husband, of course. We're traditional on this side. One birth, one death, one man. We grew up together and got scholarships to the States at the same time so we could study together. We were one of the 0.1% that were lucky enough to get temporary exit visas. And then you've got sounds going on of drones and aircraft. Schott. And he left us when? Kamal. We should work, I think. Schott. When did you say? Kamal. He was killed in 2032. There was an attack. And then there's a long pause. And then, where were you at that time? Schott. Indecipherable on the recording. Kamal. Where? Schott. I said I was in the military.
Thank you, Selma. Anwar is going to read his a section from The Key, which is his story in the book.
Hello, everybody. Mine is a short story, but I'll make it even shorter. I'll read a small part of it. It's entitled The Key. Daddy, I woke up grudgingly to the sound of Edina, our 5-year-old, then jumped out of bed, closely followed by my wife, Elsa. When we reached her room, she was sat curled up on the bed, her face twisted in terror. Tears poured down her cheeks as she continued screaming and crying. Daddy! She leapt from the bed as she cried out, burying herself in my arms. What's wrong, darling? What happened? I asked. The door, she said, gesturing out past her own bedroom door, which was always left open to the entrance hall. We didn't understand what she meant, but no matter how much we asked, her answer remained the same. The door. I looked at my wife and she said, "Go to the door, Moshe. Open it to check that nobody is there, just to be sure." Before I turned the doorknob, a thought crossed my mind and I went back to our room to grab my pistol from under the bed. Better to be ready for whatever might come. I took off the safety and headed for the door, opening it carefully, my finger shaking slightly on the trigger. I flicked on the patio lights and looked round. Nobody was there. I walked down the drive and looked up and down the road, then checked the back garden. Darkness and silence in all directions. I looked at my watch, 2 a.m. Back at the front door, I made sure to double lock it and check the house's alarm system. It confirmed that all windows and doors to the house were closed. "There's nothing there, darling," I said as I headed towards Edna's room. As I approached the bedroom door, Elsa stepped in front of me, her finger on her lips. "She's gone back to sleep." We climbed into bed without exchanging a word. It had been a long, tiring day. We were out as soon as our heads hit the pillow. My grandfather and a number of his friends in the United States had obsessed over the idea back then. It took up a great deal of their time and money over the course of their lives. It began as a simple effort to explore more effective ways of dealing with the Arabs. A number of politicians tried to assure them to brush off their concerns, but my grandfather and his friends did not share in their optimism. He was consumed by uncertainty all his life. Their concerns turned into fear as the war drums sounded in 1967. He visited the newly founded state several times and met with some of the leading politicians. He always went back to New York angry. "They are asleep at the wheel," he'd say to my grandmother. "Aren't they in a better position to know?" She'd say, "Relax, Akiva. Their intelligence service are strong and they know what they are capable of, more than we do." Then the war came, climaxing in an explosive victory. My late grandmother couldn't help reminding Akiva that there were plenty of people looking out for the state. There was no reason for him to worry so much, but he wasn't convinced. Such a small country, a slender island in an ocean of hatred. He guessed the victory that June wouldn't be the end of the story. And when he started reading names like Arafat and Habash in the American papers, his concerns only grew. They had to think about a solution, a decisive solution to this existential crisis. The state could not live under the threat of war forever. My grandfather began communicating with friends who shared his concerns and formed a loose, unnamed collective of thinkers, the nucleus of which developed a small but well-funded set of projects, including research centers and think tanks. At their inaugural conference, they put together a plan of action divided up into several stages. My grandfather canvassed the opinions of politicians, social scientists, and key intellectuals. There is no hope of coexistence, given the differences between us. The Arabs are convinced that we have built our nation on the ruins of theirs, and nothing we do will change their feeling. Peace treaties and economic programs will not work. Their sense of injustice fuels the threat we face. My grandfather was not convinced that we could buy security, whether through walls or wars. He was thinking of a more innovative, unconventional solution. So he persuaded the research centers he persuaded the research centers he'd funded to answer several specific questions, all of which pointed to one conclusion: the Arab citizens were not the true danger to the state. They could sometimes get frustrated too, but this could be absorbed with greater economic opportunities and some pragmatic policies. In fact, the findings suggested Israel should be more concerned about their state's increasingly harsh political positions towards the Arabs and the increasing power of an inward-looking, almost tribal political faction. The idiots, he would yell in agreement with the research. They are toying with the future of the state. We must do something to placate the Arab citizens. Likewise, there's no reason to make an enemy out of the West Bank Arabs, just so long as we make sure of one thing, that they stay where they are. There's no objection to granting them citizenship and civil rights after the annexation of the West Bank, so long as we are sure that they can't achieve any real power in the government. To remain consumers, not makers of policy, consumers of everything. That'll keep them quiet. Residents of the camp in neighboring countries are the core problem, however. They want to return to towns and villages that are no longer there. They dream of a world that no longer exists and cannot be restored, even if we agree to the idea in principle. Even if they return, they will not find what they are looking for, but their stubbornness will not die. They pass it on to their children and grandchildren. My grandfather collected pictures of them clutching rusty keys to houses that no longer existed. But he wasn't mocking them like others did. He felt a vague anxiety towards them, though he realized he was powerless to do anything about it. My grandfather feared those photographs of people holding keys more than any arms deals being signed by neighboring countries. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Anwar. So let's begin by asking a couple of questions. I'm curious to know, what were your reactions? We'll start with Selma, when you received the email or asking you to write a science fiction story. What was your reaction? How did you feel?
Well, I'd never written science fiction, and I don't even read, well, I hadn't really even read very much science fiction before the commission. So it was a bit daunting, and I think that, but it was quite exciting. I mean, it's very, there's something which really focuses the mind when you're given a topic to write on, even sometimes a couple of words. When I used to do short stories, I'd pick out random words. So to have this idea of writing something in the future and to try and extrapolate, because it's quite the near future for us. It's not as hard as the people who'd written for the Iraq anthology, who had 100 years from 2003. I mean, we have it's 2048, it's not that far away. So that, but I was also approached at the same time to do the same thing for a German radio station. So I was writing the same thing in two different forms, the same story for you and for them. But I think in terms of looking at particular aspects of science or political developments and seeing what the personal fallout would be for those developments, it was quite exciting and liberating as well, because you're not as constrained by current political realities. You could think of some things as getting better and improving.
Where did the idea come from? The original idea for the story?
Well, I mean, the referendum. I mean, obviously, it was quite close in my mind, and as it always is, in terms of the effects that referendum can have. So it was the idea of a great shift in what it means to be Jewish, or it becoming far more important within Israel and having this knock-on effect. Also the idea that you've got all this human capital on the Palestinian side. We're very highly educated in diaspora, across, as a refugee community as well as in the occupied territories. So like the idea of having a space where incentives can be given and freedom can be provided for people to just create scientifically, that was another sort of, I wanted something positive. I have a friend who works with blockchain currencies, and I can't say I really understand blockchain that much, but within it there is the idea that we will be moving probably inevitably away from centralized banking systems. So that, and there is something called an etho-coin or colored coins, which mean that people might be able to only bank according to causes. I mean, this is a kind of radical fringe of kind of the blockchain world, that this sort of, but that you'll be able to use coins and say, okay, I only want to trade in currencies which are good for the environment or whatever. So I have a coin which is only supporting people who live behind walls, and the idea that you've got economies all over the world, from Mexico to China to parts of, like on the border with China, of people who are walled in but are able to trade with each other, as boosting a new space and new possibilities and new science.
Well, thank you. What about yourself, Anwar? When you received the email, what did you think?
Well, like Selma, I never read any science fiction, and I'm not interested in science fiction in its narrow sense. But when I received this invitation, I thought, well, I'm into fiction. So science or not science, it's fiction. And because I'm a novelist, and a novelist thinking starts at some point in the past through the present, and it's supposed to predict something about the future. So this is my view of novel writing, that I'm supposed to be able to lead my readers into the future based on what I present to them through the past and the present. So then I convinced myself, if this is science fiction, then it is my cup of tea. So I'll try to do something that could be sold as science fiction. I don't know to what extent I succeeded in that. I'll try to inject some elements of science in my story, not too much, but most of it is fiction proper. So that's it.
So the fact that it was science fiction didn't really affect your writing process in a sense. You have a certain writing process. You once told me that you were in a symphony in an orchestra once, and you wrote a whole chapter on your hand.
Yes. Well, this is how I write. Actually, I don't sit to a desk and start sketching and writing and planning. So normally the idea of a novel comes to me in the most weird situations and unexpected. And yes, once I told you that I wrote the first, not the first chapter, but the introduction to one of my novels. Once I was in a concert hall attending an orchestra, and suddenly I felt that there's something I want to write. And I had a friend with me, and I wrote down whatever came to my mind on my palm and hairs. And when we went home, I copied it. And that was the introduction of my novel, not the introduction, the first chapter of my novel entitled Shahrazad Tells Tales No More. Yeah.
What about you, Selma? Did you find that writing this specific story meant you had to rewire your brain slightly in terms of how you write, or was it the same?
No, it was quite different, and also because I had this odd thing that I was doing it, one as a script and two as a story, and I tried at one point to just be using documents and transcripts as a form, but I think that one of the great challenges of writing science fiction is you have to create a worldscape which is slightly different, but plausible, and you have to set it up all very quickly. And it's a little bit similar to writing on something which is political, because you have to explain it quite quickly to an audience. Look, this is a very different world, without being too expositional. You don't want to constantly be sort of breaking the dreamlike state of the story and turning out and saying, this is why the robot is doing X, or this is why there's a wall around Gaza. You know, it should be natural to the flow of the story. When you've got a political work which is also scientific, or an unknown political setup, which is also, I think that the potential to fall into this trap of constantly explaining is quite big, which is why it was quite useful for me to have documents which could explain out a little bit. And then as it went on, it became more narrative, because it was a woman recording her story. I think it could have been, I probably, if I were to develop it further, I'd make it even more so and cut out more of the transcript.
I think one of the aims of this book was to talk more about Palestine and Nakba, but without actually talking about Palestine and Nakba. But so everyone wrote the stories, and as a byproduct, you did find out more about what was going on. Do you find, because there was a review in the Tel Aviv Times recently of Palestine Plus 100, and another sci-fi anthology, science fiction anthology, Israeli one called Zion Future. Sorry, I just need to check this. Zion's Fiction. So, yeah. So, in one of the things that were said was that were observed by the reviewers, that the Israeli writers hardly, I think there's maybe, he said, one or two mentions of another side, the Palestinian side. There's almost no mention. Whereas with the Palestine Plus 100, even though in my opinion it's still quite subtle, there was still a heavy mention of Palestine in the Nakba. So, it's okay. Do you find yourself, well, for maybe Selma first, in feeling envy at the Israeli writers for not having to, or having that luxury of not involving or mentioning any conflict, whereas with Palestinian writers it's there and it has to be mentioned whether or not you want it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great luxury to not be political. I mean, if you're not political, it means that things are sort of working for you, basically. Maybe that's a slightly provocative comment, but I think that the having to be constantly aware that, I mean, when I first went to the West Bank, I was in my 20s, and I felt like everybody had a kind of sixth sense. They just knew that something had happened that morning, or that a road was closed, or a bomb, somebody had been killed, and it was just, people had that built into them. And after several months there, I felt I was getting it as well. And it's a way of being constantly jarred by your situation, which makes it really impossible to kind of to get away from it and just talk about other issues. I think Palestinian writers, there's quite a good book by Marcello Di Cincio, which is called Pay No Heed to the Rockets, and he interviews Palestinian writers, mainly in the West Bank, but also in Gaza, about their writing process. And increasingly now, some are trying to write about things which aren't overtly political. I think that they're trying to, some are sort of trying to find spaces to talk about families and other issues, just because it's where they find a bit of freedom. But it's a very new trend, and and it kind of goes against the norm, which I suppose it ties in with who was it who said, how can I write of, maybe somebody can give me the name of the poet, South American poet, how can one write of flowers when there's the blood of children in the streets? I mean, it's that idea.
Yeah, I think we're a long way as Palestinians to be able to write about our families without actually writing about the occupation. It's very difficult. I mean, hopefully one day we can reach that stage, which would mean we are settled in our lives. But I don't know when that will happen. But
sorry,
yeah?
just last thing. But just I do agree with like Darwish on this, and who said that although that it is the dominant thing, that the Palestinians don't have to write only about tragedy. There's so much farce. You know, there's a great capacity to look at it from a sort of farcical, humorous angle.
Absolutely. And that angle will still be influenced, even the fun angles will still be influenced by the occupation, but it is something that we do hope we can do one day. But until we do reach that luxury, Anwar, what do you think? Do you always feel a sense of duty when you're writing your
No.
stories?
No, I mean, I have a different approach to this, and I think it's a great mistake to not to write about anything else but about warfare and blood and tragedies. And most of my novels, there are 10 of them, are not about Nakba. We've written a lot about what happened in 1948 and the wars and the tragedies. I try to approach our situation from a different angle. First, the past before the Nakba, because one of our problems is that Israelis have managed to convince the world that Palestinians don't exist. So I don't, she doesn't, we don't exist, simply. And that suddenly in 1948 or after 1948, they came from somewhere, maybe from the moon or from some other planet, and they landed in Israel, and they became refugees. So one of my novels was set long before the Nakba, and I wasn't interested in... now, this is not the worst problem that Israelis think that we are invented. We don't exist only after the Nakba. The problem is that we are feeding into this illusion, Palestinian writers and artists, because most of our writing is about the Nakba and what happened after the Nakba. But there's very little written about what life was like before the Nakba, in the 1930s, 20s, in the 19th century even. So part of my project was to revive the Palestinian life, the Palestinian society, and to present a narrative of our life before the Nakba, because we do exist. I mean, I come from Palestine. My family still lives there. I still go there for holiday. My grandfather was born in Palestine. His grandfather was born there. And we do exist. We did exist before 1948. But we don't have a proper narrative of our existence. And that's why I thought that a novelist's duty, in part, is to write our narrative that has been buried somewhere and nobody knows about it.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So, so you agree that we don't need to write about Nakba, but in writing our stories, sometimes there are. Do you think that there are sometimes subtle indicators of what's going on in Palestine, or can you avoid that? Is my question.
Whenever I write about anything, if I write a love story, then I find myself writing about our life. Yeah. So you can never shun what we've gone through and what we're living. But I mean, I don't want to write about wars all the time, about bloodshed all the time. It will be there somehow. Yeah. But I want some reader from outside Palestine, from some faraway country, to read a Palestinian novel about trivial matters that bother a Palestinian character, like himself in the UK or in Denmark or wherever they live. They don't spend their lives just thinking about tragedies and about the big issues in their lives. So I try to write about small issues that make us very similar to everybody else, no matter where they live, because I want people everywhere to just overcome that illusion that Palestinians are people who fight or people who are refugees. No, we are people who fall in love, get married, feel happy when they buy a new car, and plan the future of their kids. So this is what I would like to write about more than, without, of course, shunning the tragedy we're living in.
Yeah, that's why we thought science fiction would be a good way to kind of start that. That was one of the reasons we wanted to find that kind of common ground with the science fiction. Selma, how did Nakba affect your family? What can you tell us?
I'm half English, so it was my father. My father's from Jaffa, so when you talk about Ilam Pape, I think this work, the expulsion of the Palestinians, it picked up on two different ways that the population were forced out. One was the Palestinian population. One was attacking leadership, and the other one was attacking children. And my family is a sort of exact example of that. My grandfather was very politically active in Jaffa. He was imprisoned numerous times by the British, and had 2 assassination attempts on him by Irgun or Stern gangs. And my dad, they finally left in 1948 because my dad was hit by a grenade which was thrown from a cliff above them. And it was just a group of children, so it was clearly an attack on children. But that was the sort of the final sort of trigger which made them think, let's go, we'll go to Nablus for a while, wait till it calms down, and then come back, which of course they didn't. So it's a very, very typical story in a lot of ways. And then from there, it was like Nablus, Syria, Kuwait. They all settled in Kuwait. They were kicked out of Kuwait in 1990, which was an expulsion of 300,000 Palestinians. I grew up in Kuwait till I'd left just before then, but my family was still there. And then all, ended up, a lot of them in Jordan, some of them stateless, the ones with Egyptian papers stateless. And the family from Jaffa, so some, we're now connecting over things like Instagram, but some went up to Beirut by water, and some went down to Egypt, and some went inland. And we were the sort of inland Gulf lot, so perhaps some of the luckier ones. And I have a great uncle called Mustafa Murad Dabbagh, who was a chronicler of all the people of Palestine. So he wrote this encyclopedia of all the people of Palestine. And in the expulsion, the story is that he got onto this boat with his boxes of books, he was an inspector for all the schools in Palestine. So he had he'd go around and study the flowers and the people, and it really is one of the main documents now when books like Walid Khaldi's, which looks at all the villages which were destroyed, they go back to these books as a point of reference as to what was there before. So he had this crate with his books in it, and people said, look, the boat is overloaded, you can't bring that with you. So they had to chuck it off the boat. And then he rewrote the whole thing from memory in Beirut. But so that was the nature of Nakba for sort of my extended family.
Wow. And Anwar, you were very close to leaving Tulkarm at 18. I think you told me a story about that happened at Nakba in 1948, or maybe after. Was it? Sorry, 67.
No, not that old.
No. You said that you did mention a story about.
Born in 1948.
Sorry, my mistake.
So what
Blame it on the cold.
Anyway.
How did Nakba affect you? You did mention a story when we were in London about going on a bus, or how did Nakba affect you? Tell us how Nakba.
Okay. Now Nakba, because as I said before, my family has never been a refugee. I was born in the West Bank, and my family still lives there. And I still have my family home in a small town in the West Bank, and whenever I go on holiday, I go there. So the Nakba did not affect me directly in terms of having to live in refugee camps or moving from one town to another. But of course, from the moment I became aware of things around me, I saw people living in Tulkarem. There's a refugee camp near Tulkarem. And they were called refugees by other people who are not refugees. And of course, I didn't know what that meant. And it took me a while to understand. Probably after we almost became refugees in 1967, but we didn't become. But then I witnessed the process of people becoming refugees, because Palestinians became refugees at different times. First in 1948, then in 1967, and even in 1982, because some Palestinians from Lebanon had to leave for probably the third time to become refugees, moved from probably Haifa or Jaffa to Jordan, then to Lebanon, then from Lebanon to Tunisia in 1982 after the Israeli invasion. So
some of them ended up in Kuwait.
And then in Kuwait, and from Kuwait back to Jordan. So yeah, so you don't have to be a refugee. You just have to be a Palestinian to be part of the refugee story.
Yeah. Okay, well, one last quick question before we go to the Q&A. Are you optimistic about the future? How do you feel about it?
We have no choice but to be optimistic. I mean, the fact that we survived so far, this is what I strongly believe in. The fact that we survived so far after so many wars and massacres and attempts to annihilate us means that we're going to survive for even longer till something happens. I don't know. Maybe we should be writing about what is that might happen in the next 30, 40, 50, 100 years that will sort out this tragedy. But something will happen, and until that happens, we have to stay alive, creative, always managing to enjoy life, to have kids, fall in love, sing, and resist any circumstances that have been always driving us into dying, into vanishing. We will not vanish.
I think that was quite a good point to end. But I think I always find this question really hard. And I was asked it once on a panel, and afterwards I said to this Palestinian historian, I said, what do I say? What do I say? I don't know how. What's the future? What's the solution? You know, is there going to be peace? What do I say? And he said, well, we have a past, but we have no future. I thought, oh God, I really can't say that. I think one of the things which is great about this project and about science fiction in general is that I think you have to force yourself to think positively, and this task made me try to do that. And I think, as I mentioned, there was a project I once saw called Decolonizing Architecture by E.L. Weitzman of the Forensic Architecture Collective. And what they had done is to made these models, which I went to see in the Tate Modern, had these models of what they'd do with settlements if the West Bank was liberated. Like, how would these military structures or Israeli structures, how would they be molded into a Palestinian community? So, like, you know, take a military tower and turn it into a skate park or something like that, or like the environment or a playground. And I looked at this very expensive, elaborately done thing, and I thought, what a waste of time. I mean, this is going to happen. And which made me realize I was very blocked. I couldn't anticipate things getting better, and if everybody feels like that, then nothing is going to get better. And I think it's a job of writers and artists and scientists and everybody to keep thinking of different ways to be innovative. And I do think the Palestinians have been incredibly innovative. You'll have to look at just the way that the protests have been in Gaza. I mean, it's incredible, even without the media attention that it deserves. It just never stopped trying to think of new ways of bringing attention to their horrific situation. Yeah.
Thank you, Selma. Thank you, Anwar. We're going to go on to Q&As and a couple of comments and questions. I don't know who's got the mic. Oh, sorry, you got the mic. Any questions?
Yeah, hello. It's more a comment based on what you were just saying about what to do about it. And last night, several people in this room went to see Gillian Slovo speaking at the cathedral. And one of the things that struck me most was that she said people used to ask her father, who was a very famous revolutionary, when are we going to get democracy in South Africa? And he said, it'll come in 5 years. And he'd been saying that since 1948. But it's a very interesting thing that he always said, in 5 years it will come. And you think it through like that, and therefore you work your strategies and your tactics to make it possible. And it may not be possible, but if you don't think like that, you cannot actually put in place the right things.
And that's why I think I really admire activists. I think if you're a Palestinian writer, people always assume you're an activist, whereas I think activism is a very specific skill set, and it's a very particular way of looking at history and a movement and of coalescing things and finding points of hope and making sure that the criticism is given to the audience who are listening or the group that you're working with, but that you always end on that "we will overcome" type up. I think that a lot of fiction writers tend to be a bit more downbeat. It's a little bit more, a lot of work, particularly sci-fi, about the future is dystopic. It's very negative, particularly like, young adult fiction. It's like everything is dystopic on the market at the moment. It's like, how are things going to get better if all these teenagers are convinced that everything's coming to an end? So I think that's really good to hear. I like the idea that one has to find, in 5 years, we'll be liberated.
This is very interesting, this 5 years thing, because in the Shahrazad, the novel that I just referred to, an old woman keeps asking her husband, when will the Israelis withdraw from our land? And his answer was, on Wednesday. And then the next Wednesday, so she believed him, and on Wednesday she saw Israeli soldiers around, and they're not supposed to be there. Her husband told her they will withdraw. And she asked him, what are they doing here? And he said, oh, not this Wednesday, but he never revealed which Wednesday, because this is how Palestinians are living, and this is how they manage to maintain hope, because one day, some Wednesday, things will change, and everybody is, even small kids, have a feeling that things cannot stay the way they are. One day they will change. When we have to be able to wait for that Wednesday when things change.
Nikki?
So obviously, hello. As we know that anti-Semitism is being weaponized to stifle free speech on Palestine. So I'm just interested in has there been challenges with this book? Are you getting any backlash, and what's been that process?
So far, we have only had one problem. Someone wrote on a blog just a standard letter accusing, mainly attacking the intro. I don't think they even read the book, because if they read the book, they would have realized that none of their arguments were valid. Actually, we had two challenges. Yeah, the first one was, I think it was a Zionist body, literature body, just sending a generic letter saying, we've got a problem with the facts you mentioned in this book, ABC. We didn't reply. The second was a Belgium journalist using the book, talking about the book, and then in a completely unrelated way tying it to anti-Semitism, and this is why we've got a problem with the Jews, and all of that. And we obviously had to send a letter to the editor saying, please disconnect us from this journalist and any reference that he's got. Those were the two challenges we had, but generally speaking, we haven't had any challenges. There was the review in the Tel Aviv Times, which was fine. It was okay. The reviewer did have he didn't mention anything about anti-Semitism. He just had a bit of a problem with the fact that the Israelis in some stories were being portrayed as aggressive. Yeah, so yeah, that was it.
Hello. What would you say is a good modern definition of science fiction? So obviously 50 years ago, whenever it came into being, it was like, let's go to Jupiter, or there's a robot firing a laser. We've moved a long, long way from that now, I think. And, this book shows how you can take that term and change it. So what would be your personal definitions of a modern way of science fiction?
I would say, does anyone want to take this question?
I keep it really broad. I said to one of my friends, look, it's the first collection of Palestinian science fiction. And he said, yeah, since the Old Testament. So you can have I think any kind of fantasy. Yeah.
And also, I think anything that's in the future, that sounds ridiculous. Any stories that are set in the future, in a dystopic future, but it doesn't need to be heavy-handed with the technology. It needs. I mean, I think George Orwell, in my opinion, was quite spot on with his definition of maybe science fiction. Maybe it was more speculative, but not too heavy-handed with the modern technology and the jargon would be where we're going with science fiction. That would be my preferred type. I think you'd find this book wasn't that heavy-handed with any of that. Okay, so if there aren't any more questions, we might wrap it up and say thank you to... Oh, there's a question. Okay, sorry.
Yes, just taking up the idea you raised about historical fiction, I wonder whether you thought about a series called Palestine Minds 100, which perhaps might gain a rather more critical review in the times of Israel.
So Palestine minus 100, minus 100 years from 1948?
Yes, historical fiction.
1848.
Yeah, 1848.
Yeah, I think, Anwar, you mentioned that you would,
Yeah. Well, yeah, this is our dilemma, actually, now, and Palestinians don't seem to be aware of it, that we are maybe the only nation in the world that have to prove that we exist, because I mean what they keep telling, Israelis keep telling the world is that we don't exist. Arabs from neighboring countries went to Palestine, which was empty, to work for Jews who were living there. But it was not empty after all, because they went to work for somebody. Because we are very bad at this kind of, selling false facts and even true facts, then the whole world is buying this, that Palestinians don't exist. And I think we've not done enough to prove to the world that we do exist, and I mean, it was a whole country with agriculture, with culture, with folk tales, and one of my other novels, it's entitled Jaffa Prepares Morning Coffee. It's all about lifestyle in Palestine of Palestinians before 1948, about the Palestinian kitchen dishes, about folk songs, about all these things that could not have been invented few years back. So that we have Palestinian folklore and Palestinian cuisine means that we have Palestinian history, that some nation had been living there for a while. And I think we have not done enough about this, and we should. Thank you, Anwar. I think we're going to say thank you, Selma, and thank you, Anwar, and thank you to the International Anthony Burgess Foundation and Manchester Literature Festival and the England Arts Council for supporting us. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for the questions and everything.